So since the beginning of the open networking movement, and this goes back for those of you who were involved in around 2009-10 timeframe, it was very clear that, that the life cycle for technology adoption was ripe for a major change. And it's certainly, at that time, it wasn't completely clear how it would affect telecommunications, but only a couple of years later, probably 2011, 12, 13 timeframe, with the beginnings of the software-defined networking movement and the Open Networking Foundation. And also in 2012, 13, when the brave pioneer operators forged the Network Functions Virtualization Group within ETSI, it was very clear that telecom was going to be a major part of this open networking movement. Now, what happened is the industry responded, and we started to proliferate a whole range of different activities. It started with standards, because in telecom, that's what we had. And then it actually evolved into open source. And if you think about it, it evolved even beyond that into activities that are not really standards or open source. Activities like the Zero Touch Service Management Group that came a little later, which is something in between, or an industry group is how I've been thinking about it myself. And when we looked at the landscape in the early 2000, let's say 13, 14 timeframe, as this movement was taking shape, we only had a handful of these activities. But just within a couple of years later, there were dozens of projects, and not just projects, but organizations who were involved. And that presented a huge problem. And when I was at the Linux Foundation in the 2016-17 timeframe, some of our very large members who are participating in many projects said that, as well as operators who were starting to join, because in the early days operators were observing more than active participants, they were saying, we don't know how to make sense of 20 different open source networking projects and a half a dozen standards groups and projects within existing standards groups, not to mention other groups. And then, as a result, we actually embarked on a project that we called Harmonizing to start to make sense of all this. And that's what the subject of this panel is. It's to raise some of the issues that the industry is confronting as we're now moving into the automation era, with a big challenge of trying to put these groups in the right context, and most importantly, to discuss the role in the overall technology adoption life cycle. And I keep talking about technology adoption because I don't think it has anything to do with automation or SDN or NFV. It has to do with this fundamental way in which we're operating as an industry. So I am very pleased to be able to introduce our esteemed panelists, all who were very experienced and are representing different, not just different groups, but different constituents in this overall discussion. So first I want to introduce Daniel Barlev. He's the director in the office of the CTO at MEF, and he's responsible for a number of different initiatives there. He served on the board, and he has a long history in working with the technical and professional certification programs, as well as some of the community activities as well. And next is Alla Goldner, who's the Director of Technology, Strategy, and Standardization at Amdocs. And her interests are in the area of SDN and NFV. And of course, Alla is also here representing the Open Network Automation Platform Program, which is the Linux Foundation effort to actually address open orchestration and automation. And then finally, Nurit Sprecher, who's the head of management, virtualization, and application enablement standardization at Nokia. And if you see a common thread, everyone's based in Israel, except for me, of course, which is I'm on the other side of the world. And that was not intentional. I mean, we sort of were talking about it and laughing about it this morning. Anyhow, Nurit is also the vice chair of the ETSI Zero Touch and Service Management Group, and was the initial chair of the MEC group as well. which I think at the time was mobile edge computing, now the multi-access.
We changed it.
Computing. For any of the Etsy purists, you can correct me if I'm wrong. So I want to just to get right into this. So the first thing I want to do is to raise a question to Alla. I think I'll start there. So from the outset of the ONAP project, ONAP gained a lot of momentum once it was formed in the early, I think we announced it at Mobile World Congress in 2017. Right. So it's only 2 years old. It's hard to believe it's only 2 years old, given the attention it's received. It's the flagship product of the Linux Foundation networking activity, and now I think we have close to 90 members, I believe, in LFN.
I think even more than
90 or 100 members in the LFN initiative, and these are dues-paying members. This is an activity that you have to have some skin in the game to be able to participate. And of those 90 or 100 members, about a quarter are operators. Actually, probably close to maybe a third are operators. So it has some of the largest operators in the world. And as the ONAP community has grown, of course, the code base, the scope, and the complexity has grown as well. So the question I have for you all is that now that ONAP is turning 2 years old, so can you talk about the role of standards in ONAP?
Sure. So first of all, and I think it is very important to say that I don't think that, open source in some way compete with standards. Open source implement parts of the standards and complement the other part. So in ONAP and DTED, you say it was a journey because, at the beginning, the most important thing was to actually make the integration between OpenO and ecom work and implement several use cases, basically, to test that integration. Then the next was to enhance functional, non-functional basis. In the third release, which is called Casablanca, we did introduce several functional requirements and new use cases such as CCVPN, some foundation for 5G and so on. But at the same time, I think starting from the third release, which basically means a year after launch, the need in having standardized interfaces, started really to emerge. We started to hear it more and more loudly as a request coming from the service provider and also as something that vendors wanted to implement. And it basically, I would say, it started firstly from TMF API, because since the beginning we had that external API project where, the interface with external system have to be defined, MEF interfaces, but then also now I would say that one of the hottest topics that we actually face in ONAP is Etsy, so defined interfaces, and we already have several implementations, and we plan to do more in the next releases, and there are lots of discussions around this, really. So, it is really now to see what is the most important, the emerging interface that we need to implement now, or what can perhaps wait a few months to implement it next, but there is no question that ONAP, where it needed, is implementing standardized interfaces. So this is where it stands right now.
And I think it's come a long way from the beginning, where we were really focused on creating not only a code base, but a representation of what open orchestration is. And now, in the real world, now we're having to address APIs. And hold that API thought. I'm going to move on to Daniel. Daniel, MEF is obviously known for driving the multi-billion, I think, what does Nan call it, the $80 billion market for carrier Ethernet. And it's no joke. I mean, it's permeated into everything, just like it has in every other industry. And but now, looking ahead, MEF is setting its sights on the MEF 3.0 framework, which it's really intended to accelerate the introduction of these new cloud-oriented or cloud-based services. And in doing that, MEF has created the Lifecycle Services Orchestration reference architecture that I think many who have been looking at this problem are familiar with. And the question I have for you, Daniel, is sort of turning it around. So as a starting point, maybe you can talk about the role that open source is playing in creating that and sustaining that reference architecture, and then also about how this is playing out in some of the new services like the recently announced SD-WAN standard service, the first SD-WAN standard.
So, excuse me. So the work of MEF is really very abstract. We've been defining many years services. We're still defining services. We started by defining carrier Ethernet services, now optical transport, IP, SD-WAN, security as a service. And when you define these services, what comes out of that is we now need to be able to orchestrate those services. So we created the paradigm that you mentioned, lifecycle service orchestration, LSO, to describe where and how you would orchestrate those services. And the LSO paradigm, that framework, that architecture is purely abstract, conceptual. We need players to actually go and implement it. And so that's the importance of open source in the sense that it accelerates the market in terms of showing examples of how to implement the abstract concepts that we're describing, that we're defining. Now you could ask, okay, well, where's the interaction there? Okay, so you're doing the abstract stuff in MEF, and the open source communities are actually delivering examples of how to implement that. At the end of the day, the problem that we're solving is interoperability. I think that's true for a lot of standards organizations, and it's true at MEF as well. How do you interoperate as a vendor, and how do you interoperate as a service provider? And that's where the LSO kicks in with its reference points, its touch points, if you like. And Alan mentioned earlier that one of the working groups or projects in ONAP is called external APIs, and they have the need to interoperate or interface with other parts of the ecosystem. And we have done joint work together at a specific point that we call LSO Legato. You can describe it as the northbound interface of ONAP. What are the APIs that are going to sit at that conceptual boundary point? And I think that it's been very instructive to see how ONAP have collaborated with MEF, also with TM Forum, and as you're mentioning now, also on the SOL in different places in the architecture. And I think this is a very good example of sort of the collaboration, the work that was done in MEF being reused in ONAP, but also ONAP is impacting us, open source is impacting us, because as they implement our work, it turns from something that's abstract into something that's being tried and tested. And we learn from those examples. We learn from the use cases that they really want to implement, because everything obviously is contribution driven. Also in the open source community, are they implementing carrier Ethernet, or are they implementing mobile use cases and so on? So that feedback is very, very important into the standards industry. It's not one way. It's not, oh, we defined it, now go implement it. It's very much a feedback mechanism where we can improve what we're doing based on the work that they're achieving.
Yeah, I think it's about turning the conventional wisdom upside down. I mean, instead of standards driving implementations, now we're talking about implementations, validating standards, and with a feedback loop so that we can continue to validate really both standards and open source implementations. Okay, so Narit. So like its predecessor, the ETSI NFV ISG, ETSI ZSM ISG, the Zero Touch Service Management Group and effort, is really a non-traditional industry group, at least in terms of telecommunication standardization, of which all three of you, and well, all four of us have had a tremendous amount of experience over the years. And the group is more focused on operationalizing the concepts we're talking about, much broader than any of these projects, way broader. If we talk about the big picture, ZSM is the big picture. And as a result, it's focused on these challenges of how do we take this technology and actually deploy it in a way that makes sense from a business perspective. So it's truly the intersection of technology, business, and operations. And as a result, the question I have for you is to share your perspective, again, with this theme of how ZSM is embracing both open source and standards. And by the way, since Daniel and Alla both brought it up, and APIs, we can throw that into the mix.
Right. First of all, if you allow me, I would like to second what we heard from Ala and Daniel about the need for both worlds to live together and work together. I would say that it's working in iteration mode, right? And I think there was a very good paper that was submitted by the Linux Foundation Networking when it was established, establishing the ONAP group, about the need for collaboration between the different organizations and the need for specification and the need for open source, and that they need to work in iteration mode. So if you think about the past, we used to define standards, then everyone went home, developed them. After a few years, we started looking at feedbacks, and we tried to fix what we have specified much before. So we are learning, right? So we want to be more agile about this. So working in iteration loop, doing something, implementing, get feedback from that, improving, or whatever. But to do that, you need a good architecture to enable that. And if you look at the industry, a few years ago, maybe 2 years ago, there was a big mess, right? So many activities, so many architectural framework for management defined in a way which is not compatible, in different approaches, many silos, many lack of alignment, lack of interoperability. I think ONAP did a very good step in converging and bringing together two open source initiatives and working together. And what we see in the industry is that there are a lot of good works that are being done for different pieces of the puzzle, because at the end of the day, to provide end-to-end service, it includes many aspects and many pieces. But if they don't fit nicely together, and if there is no alignment and there is no synergy between the work, so we cannot achieve this interoperability end-to-end. And by the way, I believe interoperability is really a key for all of what we do, but also I think open source is a lot about co-creation, right? We cannot do it all by yourself. Let's do it as an industry effort and do it together. Now what we miss in the industry is really end-to-end architectural framework that everyone agrees around it and everything can fit nicely into that, and to provide and enable the end-to-end service automation. So what we identify is the lack of that framework, and we set up the ISG with the definition to specify such architectural framework and to accelerate the definition to get open source initiatives, the key ones, and the standard organizations to align with us and to ensure that their solutions are fitting into the architectural vision. So, so what we have defined, as we presented yesterday, we have a separation of concern. We have a management domains for each domain. It can be a technological domain, administrative domain, and we have the end-to-end service management, very much aligned with what British Telecom presented this morning. Now, if you think about, okay, how the different activities fit into that, and it's a service-based architecture. In order to enable that alignment and interoperability, you must make it modular. If you don't make it modular, you cannot do that. And you cannot enhance, and you cannot enhance even, not extend and not enhance as you go. So if you think about SA5, SA5 is a management domain of the RAN, of the core. Even ORAN can be a management domain of the RAN. You have the transport, you have ITF, BBF for the fixed access. You have the cloud domain from NFV, and you have different things that are coming from MEF as APIs that can be taken to the orchestration, TMF, etc. And what we need to do is to ensure that they are fitting into that. So SA5 did a big step in moving to service-based architecture. And the idea is that you have a domain, and we support different approaches for automation. So we don't pose one size fit all. So you can have different approaches for automation in different domains. What you need to do in order to enable the end-to-end automation, you need to expose your capabilities in the domain, your service capabilities, and the end-to-end service management will utilize that to enable the end-to-end automation. So it can delegate some of the automation to the domain, that it can be done in the domain level, and what cannot be done, it will be escalated to the end-to-end level. So this is the architectural framework, and what we plan to do is to work together with the different organizations to ensure this alignment. Next week in ONS, there is a meeting between ONAP and ZSM, and hopefully we will identify these areas, how we can work on this modularity based on the integration fabric, based on the data services, and ensure alignment.
Thank you. Thank all of you. What I want to do now is just pause to take a question, just because I'd like to raise some other topics, but before, does anybody want to raise something to the panel? Is there a mic, please? Yes.
Hello. Just with regard to open source, I just want your view on how do you ensure that open source is adopted and that it's ready for a production environment where you might have high reliability concerns. You need to train your DevOps team to be able to implement, analytic applications, integrations, design your services, and all of that. So how do you ensure that an open source solution is adopted and production ready?
Okay, well, we'll let the open source representative address that one first.
Yeah, actually,
Oh.
it's funny because if I count the years I spent in standards, probably by far more than in open source, but yes, the last 2 years I spent in ONAP. So I would, first of all, it is very important to highlight, to mention that, any open source is not product. Open source is a platform that you can or cannot productize, but it is not something that service provider can just, download and deploy a network and it will work. No, the answer is no. We provide a set of capabilities, we provide platform, still, vendor or service provider own workforce is needed in order to deploy that, and this is very important thing to mention because, this is something which is basically discussed and we have been asked many times by service providers what it takes, so it is very important to highlight that it is not a product, it is a platform to be implemented. Now, secondly, service provider may have some specific use cases where not all the modules of, open source or ONAP specifically, which I was talking about, are needed. So you also need to identify what is MVP, what is needed, what is set of functionalities, whether the current release already includes it, and so on. On the non-functional front as well, we in ONAP support a lot of non-functional requirements, on platform resiliency, scalability, security, and so on. Starting from the second release, from Beijing release, we identified actually 7 categories for non-functional requirements, and each one of them proceeds and extends with each one of the release, and those requirements, by the way, have the highest priority. Still, each service provider may have its own additional requirement, so which would come on top of it, right? So it is really, as Nurit was saying, also not one size fits all. It needs to be seen what are specific requirements of the service provider. Now, on the second part of your question, speaking about, integration effort and DevOps and how it works, it is also the case that, we dedicate a lot of efforts in ONAP to make those processes more automatic and really to move to those, continuous cycles operation between integration and development. Frankly saying, I cannot, assure that we are there already. This is a journey as well, but we are making very big steps towards that and working a lot, lots of discussion, lots of improvements per each one of the releases. So I think that, it's a bit chicken-egg problem, asking, is it productization ready? And then waiting, or jumping into the boat and taking the first step and making whatever is needed in order to make it product. So, obviously I support the second way forward because there is always ways to improve and areas to be improved. But, once there is a decision to deploy and clearly identified areas and modules and functionalities of what is needed, what is not, it can be taken from there. And specifically for ONAP, I think that at this point of time, it is ready to be taken and making product out of it. Yes.
Okay. Nurit, did you have a...
Yeah, I just wanted to add to one of the points that Ala mentioned. I remember last year we've seen a call from 2 Tier 1 operators in Europe for other operators to join effort to agree on a common set of requirements that can be a consensus to the open source work. And I think here is the role of specification group, right? Where is the right place to gain this consensus? What is the organization that know how to reach consensus? This is a specification group. So if you look about ETSI ZSM, for example, since this is really end-to-end, this is really something that is very broad, something that is really talking about automation, something that is really talking about and will face a lot of challenges in the development because there are many things that are still, evolving from technology perspective. I think it's very, very important that all the operators join effort together in ZSM and help to bring their requirements, their needs, their operational perspective, their view, and to help us doing it appropriately, which will be a good foundation for the open source implementation.
Boy, I think Ala touched on a really, really, really interesting point that I've been thinking about. Most of the telecom networks that we have today and will have for a long time are built using vendor products. So the real question in my mind is how do standards and open source help vendors build products that promote interoperability, as Daniel said, and bring new technology and capabilities to what the service providers can offer. So can we talk about that just a little bit more from all the panelists about the role of proprietary vendor solutions given the standards and open source efforts that are going on?
So perhaps I'll jump in there. When you build an architecture, you try and do it in a modular way, and you do it in such a way that different vendors can specialize, do their best of breed solution in a particular area, and then interoperate with the rest of the ecosystem. And it should be that whether it's commercial product or whether it's open source product or whatever, it should all work together. And I think that's the point sometimes that's missed, that by doing this, this emphasis on a consensus of architecture and terminology and everything that goes along with it, it gives the vendors and others the opportunity basically to focus on what they're really good at, rather than trying to constantly rework stuff with other players, with other vendors, and doing a very customized interaction, interoperation. So I think this is, the huge value of standardization, and it enables this transition of the service providers from, let's call it, legacy approaches to implement on an incremental basis these new solutions and accelerate innovation. And I think you're seeing it very well with ONAP, for example, that they can see these examples of how they can do their bit well and fit in well with the rest of the ecosystem. So I think it goes hand in glove. I think that's the vision.
I just want to make an observation on this point, and that is, you can look at almost any software developed within the last few years, and there's going to be open source in it. Open source is not a feature. It's a fundamental software architect paradigm that we're not turning back. I mean, there are the number of open source initiatives. If you look at some of the surveys, they're in the tens of millions and growing, not quite exponentially, but it's just huge. And the more proprietary the code is, there's no doubt that there's a litany of open source code in those implementations. So everything has open source. That's the point. The question is, in the harmonization from that context is, so do you adopt, like what Ala was suggesting, an entire platform? Well, maybe not yet. Maybe we're not ready for that. Do you adopt major pieces of functionality? Do you plug in do you start with a proprietary piece? Do you start with an open source piece? The answer to that question is talk to the operators. We can't answer that question. It's the operators' purview as to how they want to build large software capabilities within their organization. It's not something standards bodies, ZSM, any of our bodies, we're responding to operators, not dictating to operators. And I think that's true for LSO, for ONAP, for every effort we participate in. So, okay, Robin, I'll take a short question because I do have some other. Well, actually, go ahead, Robin. We're gonna take a short Robin's question and then gonna move on, and then we'll come back to your question.
So it's more a comment than a question. Okay. but maybe you can respond to it. So I would differ a little bit, from what Daniel, what you were sort of saying. I'm not so sure it's always completely aligned between open source and standards. I actually think there's a healthy tension, which is really not a bad thing, though. Sometimes, tension or, dare I say it, competition is kind of what makes this industry really move on. So I do take your point. I think we've got to a point now where you can have a pretty healthy relationship, and you can plug in certain pieces into architectures that I think Nurut was sort of talking about, where you have that more agreed architecture, and you can either plug in proprietary or vendor-driven kind of open source or white box open source. And I think it's one of the interesting things that sort of happened is that this tension has led to a lot of these newer projects coming along. Some of the initial kind of open source projects, I think let's be honest, some of them did have question marks over them. There were issues. Were they always delivering the way that was really desired? Well, probably not. I kind of mentioned in my talk earlier, this idea that, interoperability has been one question mark. And I think that is a fair comment. There were issues over interoperability. But I think one of the sort of things that it did very well, though, is it showed a more agile way of developing. And that kind of forced the hand as well as operators and the big vendors to respond to that. And I think we're now getting to a point where this healthy tension has got us to a point where you're going to really see some deployments. Now, whether that's always going to be, like you say, Mark, whether it's going to be the full platform or not is another matter. But it's almost like it doesn't really matter too much, does it? Because the one thing we could probably all agree upon is that this is going to be a mixed environment. It is going to be hybrid. There's no pure open source, and there's not going to be any pure kind of proprietary deployments anymore. It is going to change. It just depends on how fast, and there probably are going to be differences between different sections of the industry. But I would sort of say, kind of controversially maybe, but roll on that tension. We shouldn't be frightened of it. It's another way of looking at competition.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to make just a couple of points just in response.
Okay, well, a quick one, because I
think the transformation of the SDOs has not really been driven at all by that healthy tension of the open source. In our case, in the case of MEF, it's been driven by the service providers coming in saying, we are competing with the cloud providers. We need to deliver telecom services as quickly and as easily as they deliver their services. And that has been what has changed our whole outlook on agile development of standards, much more so than the emergence of the open source projects. I would say it's really been driven by our membership saying, move faster or die, to be blunt. I think that the healthy competition and tension also arises, just in response to the point you made, between the open source and the SDOs, is that we're all competing for essentially the same resources. We're competing for attention from the vendors and service providers and other ecosystem stakeholders, right? Because they've got a limited number of subject matter experts, and they just can't be putting everybody in the same, all over the place. They're working here and here and here, stretched too thin. So obviously you're competing for their time and attention, and that's very important. Just like in the free market, you have to be relevant. So if you want their resources, then you have to make yourself adapt and be relevant.
Yeah, I think the landscape has changed dramatically since those beginning open source projects, and I can just give you the one data point. What's the first open source networking project? It was Open Daylight, and I was heavily involved in Open Daylight. There wasn't a single operator involved in the beginning for the first couple of years, not one. Now we couldn't imagine starting an open source project, a standards activity, without a critical mass of operators.
Absolutely.
So. Now, I think the one observation I want to make about the panel, because I thought it's really interesting, is that I don't think there's a question that we believe that open source and standards has a role. But the question is, and this is maybe more fundamental, is how do we accelerate the harmonization initiative when we really don't even have a place to have the discussion? So I just wanted to know from each of your perspectives, how do we, what can we do and what can your organization do maybe to help that along?
The collaboration between SDOs and open source.
I'm saying, we have no place to have a discussion that says, I'm going to take dozens of projects and we're going to harmonize them. By the way, individual groups do that, but that's called the me-centric world. Oh, my group is in the middle of the world, so plug into me. Well, that's not harmonization. That's proprietary. But I wanted to just get your individual perspectives from the standards, open source, and whatever ZSM is, something bigger, the big picture. How are we going to help?
We're doing it bilaterally at the moment on a
Yeah, why don't we let Alice start?
Yeah,
Because, we'll start from the open source, and then maybe Nareed, and then Daniel, you can wrap up with standards, okay?
Okay, so actually, just one comment to make, which also relates to the previous conversation. I think that there is no big issue in harmonization of the work done by open source and standards. I do think there is a lot of space for improvement actually on the interaction between the different SDOs in terms of defining end-to-end solution. Like for instance, if we talk about 5G and network slices, and there is core part, RAN part, transport part, cloud part, and and there is no single organization so far until now defining it. ZSM is planning to do a great job in that field, but let's be honest, we don't know how much time it takes. And in the meantime, for example, in ONAP, when we face the issue of how we implement network slicing, we face all those issues because, we need to be looking into what BBF has defined, HBP has defined, and so on. So on that space, I think a lot of improvement is needed to actually align and correlate the different standards activities. Now, between open source and standards, I can bring some concrete examples. So first of all, it is about people. And we do face quite a few subject matter experts attending both ETSIS activities and TMF activities and attending ONAP activities, for instance. And, and if we discuss in ONAP what ETSI interface we need to implement and how, it is usually that ETSI people participate in those discussions and bring their proposals, right? So it is not about different people. I would say that having the same people pushing for those things in a different organization is a must. Secondly, we do have, several collaboration activities, such as, for instance, I think Nurit mentioned before, next week we are going to have a joint workshop between ONAP and ZSM, trying to look into that and seeing what can be done jointly, whether we, for instance, can define some mapping, whether we can do more, it will be done. Perhaps more is needed. It is a bit, challenging because it is a different organizations. We know that the most significant progress typically is achieved by face-to-face meeting. It is quite challenging to schedule more face-to-face meetings because we're talking about, again, people who travel frequently, and we are talking about, also travel budget and all these things. But we are going there. The point is that we know what is the right thing to do. We may not be taking the shortest path there, but we are taking path there. So this is how I see this going.
Nareed?
Yeah, maybe just to mention, there was some attempts in the history to bring multi-SDOs together to discuss modeling, common information model, or whatever. Good discussions, nice exchanges, good intention, but nothing was following up. So it didn't work so far, and I think the establishment and setup of ZSM is a good opportunity to bring this together because we see the overall picture, we see the different organizations, how they fit into, and we can enable this alignment and collaboration. We start with the significant and the key organizations because you need to do it step by step. You cannot build it all the way from the beginning. And for example, with different organizations, since we're working on end-to-end network slicing, so definitely we already had a discussion with SA5, with GSMA, which looked at the requirements. We started with ONAP, because ONAP is a key initiative for the end-to-end automation, and we believe that there is synergy, and we believe that the two organizations believe that data collection, analytics, and orchestration are key to enable this automation. So they have the same common approach, and we need to really to see now how we can use ONAP to, to implement, take some capabilities to implement some of the capabilities that ZSM provide, or take it as a domain as a whole, or end-to-end, or whatever. So this is subject to discussion, but I think the presence of ZSM is a good starting point for that, and I think Ala is right, we cannot say how long it will take, but definitely this is a good place to bring them all together.
It is a good place, and we've had a lot of discussion about ZSM and ONAP. Okay, we have about 99 more projects we need to go and have ZSM harmonized for us. That's the nature of this problem. It's much, much broader than the interactions between project to project, which is what the intent of this discussion was. So on that note, Daniel, since you're going to give us all the answers, why don't you share the MEF perspective on how we can accelerate the harmonization initiatives?
Right, so I completely agree with the points that Alan made. I think the example that Marie gave of the discussion about the common information model between SDOs is very illuminative, very illustrative, because I think it's getting on for 2 years ago. Over a dozen SDOs got together.
It's way beyond 2 years.
No, but there was a specific meeting approximately 2 years ago where they got together in Germany and they tried to agree a way forward to work on information models, whether it's federated or whatever. Whether it was good intentions or not, there was strong attempts to do follow-up. But there are a lot of cultural issues because information models, this is just an example, represent different ways of thinking, different schools of thought, different cultures. And it's not by accident that you have a range of SDOs, because the SDO is not, each SDO is not only trying to solve a particular problem in the ecosystem, it's a collection of human beings with ways of thinking and certain culture that tend to get together and work together and collaborate. And if they can't collaborate, then they go off to other SDOs where they can collaborate and they do have similar thinking. So I think the information model story is a very good example that if you try and get this harmonization across all the organizations, I think you should aim to try and educate everybody about what each one is doing, okay? And then specific needs will be addressed, and where the cat food is, the cats will go, Shachar explained to us, and they will address the particular issues bilaterally in order to increase the collaboration. But I don't see an overarching harmonization framework working based on the example of the information model that I gave.
Yeah, but that exactly, let me interrupt, exactly why if you look at the ZSM architecture, so you have different domains, different scope of expertise, and there is no necessarily need to align the details of each domain across the industry. But you need to do is to abstract it in a common way to the end-to-end solution that can enable all of this to work together. And that's the role that we are playing with ZSM there.
All right, we only have a couple minutes left, so we can take a short question. I think there was one somewhere. Okay, of course, it's the farthest distance to bring the mic to the speaker, but that seems to always happen.
I think you're supposed to say, tell jokes among yourselves.
When you have when you have automation, it will be transferred automatically.
Use your mobile phone.
Okay, so almost forget my question. Okay, sorry, just kidding. So for sure, if I understand it correct, okay. So in the beginning, you just said, okay, open source is a
Can you
platform.
turn the mic? I'm not sure if the mic's on.
We don't hear you well.
Okay,
Speak closer.
okay. I think in the beginning, you just told us, okay, open source is just a platform more than a production. Okay, so how could we help our customer, help our operators that it go production? From my understanding, if our customer, our vendors need the vendor, our operators or carriers need a vendor to help to develop based on open source. I don't know if I understand it's correct. If we still need a PSR, a primary integration system integration provider to do it. This is my first question.
So you're asking, how do we take open source to production?
Yes, how we let open source based platform go to production?
Well, just to be clear on open source, it's never been an objective of open source to take it to production. I don't know of any project in open source networking, and I've been familiar in working on many of them. And it's just not an objective. The objective is to provide a framework that you can use to build a product on, for vendors to add value on, to create some way to integrate
Okay.
with it. To
The question is who
bring
will.
that in. It's not intended to be a product.
Okay.
It's not like some other open source domains.
Yes,
where
my question is who will take this responsibility to help
system
the.
integrators take that responsibility.
I think I can
Vendors.
respond on that. So basically, if you look on other existing open source and products coming out of those open source products, it is typically vendor distribution, right? Yeah. So it really depends, you can call it differently, but eventually vendor would be taking, either the whole thing or the necessary part required for implementation of some specific use cases required by service provider and make productized version of this. And as Mark has mentioned, it would not happen within the open source community. It is not something that open source community is supposed to provide. Open source community builds platform with sufficient level on functional and non-functional requirements support. But service provider eventually is supposed to get productized version, which may be an open source distribution provided by the vendor.
Yes, I understand. That you mean, okay,
Well, actually, we're going to have to wind down. I think we've run out of time, so I'm sorry to
okay, just one more question.
Well, actually, but I have to defer to the chair of the session because we're.
We have a break after the next talk, so.
Do you want to? Okay.
Okay.
Okay, we can
One
take
more
the-
question. Okay. Nowadays, we are no ER.
Wait. I think we said we're going to take the question at the break, right?
Yeah, we have another talk, then we have a break, so why don't you ask
Okay,
after
okay.
the break?
Okay, and just first, I just wanted to thank the panelists because this is a really important topic, and thank you both. Thank all
Thank you,
three of you,
Mark.
rather.
Thank you, Mark.
So the second thing is that I think Nareet mentioned the white paper, the harmonization white paper. Well, I was actually the editor for that white paper. So if anybody wants a copy of that to understand what we had addressed in the Links Foundation, see me afterwards. I'd be glad. I can freely distribute that to you. So let me know. And in the meantime, we will be talking about this topic next year as well, because I don't think we're going to resolve it anytime soon. So
No,
thank you.
but we may be in a better situation.
We will be in a better situation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mark.
All right.